You thought awakening would make you unstoppable, more driven, more disciplined, more ambitious. Instead, your motivation collapsed. The goals that once pushed you out of bed now feel hollow. The rewards that once excited you feel strangely irrelevant. You're not lazy, you're not broken, you're waking up. What you are experiencing is not a failure of will, it is a collapse of borrowed desire. Before awakening, much of your motivation was fueled by unconscious forces, the need for approval, the fear of falling behind, the hunger to prove your worth. These forces are powerful. They can make a person work endlessly, but they do not make a person whole. When awakening begins, the psyche withdraws energy from what no longer reflects the true self. This feels like exhaustion, confusion, even apathy, but in truth, it is a psychological reorganization. The soul is no longer willing to be bribed by symbols of success that were never its own. Old ambitions begin to dissolve because they were rooted in identity illusions. You wanted the title, the status, the admiration, not because they fulfilled you, but because they protected you from emptiness. Awakening removes that protection. It forces you to sit with the question you avoided for years: why do I want what I want? This is why productivity drops. The inner engine that once ran on anxiety, comparison, and future fantasy shuts down. You cannot force it back online. And trying to do so only creates inner conflict, burnout disguised as discipline. But something quieter is forming beneath the surface, a different kind of motivation, one that does not scream, rush, or prove. It moves slowly, deliberately, and without spectacle. It is motivation rooted in meaning, not compensation. Awakening does not destroy motivation, it destroys false motivation. In this phase, rest is not avoidance, it is integration. Stillness is not stagnation, it is recalibration. The psyche is learning to act from alignment rather than fear. When action returns, it will feel less dramatic but more honest, less urgent but more enduring. You may never chase the same dreams again, but the ones that emerge will belong to you. And that is the difference between ambition and purpose. Loss of motivation after awakening is not a personal failure, even though it often feels like one. For years, motivation was driven by forces that operated beneath conscious awareness. Desire was shaped by comparison, fear of falling behind, the need to be seen as valuable, and the quiet terror of being insignificant. These pressures created momentum. They kept the psyche moving forward, chasing goals, collecting achievements, and building an identity that felt secure. When awakening begins, these unconscious engines lose their grip. The inner world no longer responds to the same incentives, and the sudden absence of drive is experienced as emptiness, confusion, or exhaustion. What actually disappears is not motivation itself, but the psychological tension that once powered it. Much of what people call ambition is rooted in unresolved inner conflict. The need to prove worth, to outrun shame, or to secure love through performance creates a constant inner pressure. Awakening brings this pressure into awareness. Once seen clearly, it can no longer operate in the same way. The psyche refuses to keep spending energy on goals that were never chosen freely. This refusal feels like collapse, but it is more accurately a withdrawal of psychic energy from inauthentic pursuits. As awareness deepens, the meaning structures that once organized life begin to dissolve. Titles, timelines, and external milestones lose their emotional charge. What once felt urgent now feels arbitrary. This is deeply unsettling because identity was intertwined with striving. Without the familiar pull toward achievement, a person may feel directionless, as though something essential has been lost. Yet what is being lost is not purpose, but borrowed meaning. The sigh. Che is clearing space for something more internally grounded, even though it has not yet taken form. During this phase, the nervous system also undergoes change. The body has been conditioned to operate in a state of chronic alertness, interpreting pressure as purpose. When awakening reduces identification with fear and future fantasy, the nervous system shifts toward regulation. Energy that was once consumed by mental tension becomes quiet. From the outside, this looks like lethargy or lack of ambition. Internally, it is a rebalancing. The body is learning that survival is not dependent on constant striving. This period often brings guilt and self-judgment. People compare their current state to who they used to be and conclude that something has gone wrong. They try to force motivation back through discipline, routines, or productivity systems. This creates inner resistance because the psyche cannot be coerced into returning to a structure it has outgrown. Effort applied in the wrong direction drains energy rather than restoring it. What is needed is not more pressure, but patience and honesty. Loss of motivation is also a confrontation with emptiness. Without constant doing, unresolved emotions and unanswered questions rise to the surface. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it reveals how much activity was used as avoidance. This confrontation is not a mistake, it is a necessary passage. The psyche must face the void left behind when false desires fall away. Only then can a more authentic orientation to life emerge. Over time, a different quality of movement begins to appear. It is quieter and slower, no longer fueled by anxiety or comparison. Action arises from resonance rather than compulsion. There is less urgency to achieve and more sensitivity to what feels meaningful. This new motivation does not shout or rush. It waits until something genuinely matters, then moves with steadiness and depth. What feels like stagnation is actually gestation. The psyche is reorganizing around truth instead of fear. Motivation has not disappeared, it has gone underground to be reshaped. When it returns, it will no longer be driven by the need to become someone else, but by the impulse to express what has already been found within. Old goals lose their power not because you have failed, but because they were never truly yours to begin with. From early on, the psyche absorbs values, ambitions, and definitions of success from the surrounding world. Family expectations, cultural ideals, social comparison, and unconscious imitation shape desire long before conscious choice is possible. These goals feel personal because they are emotionally charged, but their energy does not originate in the authentic self. They are inherited, copied, or adopted as a way to belong, to be safe, or to feel worthy. For a long time, borrowed goals function effectively. They provide direction and structure, especially in a world that rewards conformity and measurable success. Chasing them gives a sense of movement and identity. The psyche says, "I am someone because I am progressing towards something." Yet beneath this movement is a subtle disconnection. The satisfaction gained from achievement is short-lived, requiring constant renewal through the next milestone. The goal must always be updated because it was never rooted in inner necessity. When awakening begins, this borrowed structure starts to weaken. Awareness exposes the gap between outer striving and inner truth. The psyche begins to ask questions that were previously silenced by busyness. Why does this matter to me? Who am I trying to impress? What fear disappears if I succeed? These questions drain energy from goals that depended on unconscious motivation. What once felt urgent now feels strangely empty, as though the emotional fuel has evaporated. This loss of power can be deeply unsettling. Goals were not just targets, they were anchors for identity. Without them, the sense of self feels unstir. The mind interprets this instability as loss of direction, laziness, or failure. In reality, the psyche is disengaging from a role it no longer believes in. It is no longer willing to sacrifice life energy for symbols that do not reflect inner values. Borrowed goals are often rooted in compensation. They promise relief from feelings of inadequacy, invisibility, or uncertainty. Success becomes a substitute for self-acceptance. Awakening disrupts this dynamic by bringing the underlying emotional wounds into awareness. Once seen clearly, compensation loses its persuasive power. The psyche recognizes that no amount of external achievement can heal what requires inner integration. As a result, the goal collapses, not out of weakness but out of clarity. This phase often brings a sense of emptiness or grief. There may be mourning for the future that was imagined, the person one thought they would become. Letting go of borrowed goals can feel like letting go of meaning itself. Yet meaning was never located in the goal, it was projected onto it. When the projection is withdrawn, the object appears hollow, and the disappointment feels personal. In truth, what is being reclaimed is psychic energy that was misplaced. The absence of compelling goals creates a necessary pause. The psyche cannot immediately replace borrowed ambitions with authentic ones, because authenticity cannot be manufactured. It must be discovered through listening rather than striving. This listening period often feels unproductive, but it is essential. It allows unconscious values, neglected interests, and suppressed instincts to surface without being overridden by external demands. Gradually, new directions begin to form. They may look smaller, slower, or less impressive than the old goals, but they carry a different weight. They feel alive rather than impressive, meaningful rather than strategic. These directions do not need constant motivation because they are aligned with inner necessity. Action flows from resonance, not obligation. Old goals lose power because they belong to a version of you shaped by adaptation and survival. Their fading is not a loss of ambition, but a return of authenticity. What replaces them will not be driven by the need to become acceptable, but by the desire to express what has quietly been waiting to live. The psyche withdraws energy from false identities not as an act of punishment, but as a natural correction towards psychological wholeness. For much of life, identity is constructed through adaptation. Roles are adopted to gain approval, ensure safety, or secure belonging. These identities feel real because they are emotionally reinforced by rewards and avoidance of pain. Over time, they become habitual masks worn so consistently that they are mistaken for the self. Yet beneath these constructions there is always a tension, because maintaining a false identity requires constant expenditure of inner energy. A false identity survives on attention, validation, and repetition. It must be defended, maintained, and continually proven. The psyche invests energy into this defense because, at an earlier stage, the identity served a necessary function. It protected the individual from rejection, chaos, or inner fragmentation. However, as awareness deepens, the original function of the identity becomes obsolete. What once ensured survival now restricts growth. The psyche recognizes this imbalance long before the conscious mind does. When this recognition occurs, energy begins to withdraw. Tasks that once felt easy become draining. Roles that once provided a sense of purpose feel heavy or meaningless. This shift is often interpreted as depression, laziness, or loss of discipline. In reality, the psyche is refusing to energize structures that no longer reflect inner truth. It is an act of conservation, not collapse. Energy is being reclaimed from performances that require self-betrayal. This withdrawal can feel disorienting because identity and energy are intimately linked. When the psyche stops fueling a role, the sense of self attached to it begins to dissolve. The individual may feel empty, confused, or detached from their previous life. This is not because something essential has been lost, but because something artificial is no longer being sustained. The discomfort arises from the gap between who one has been and who one has not yet discovered how to be. False identities are often built around external definitions of worth. They rely on achievement, usefulness, attractiveness, or moral superiority to justify existence. As long as the psyche invests energy in these definitions, the individual feels driven and productive. Once that energy is withdrawn, the drive collapses. What remains is a raw encounter with being without the familiar scaffolding of roles. This encounter can feel frightening because it offers no immediate direction or validation. During this phase, there is often a strong impulse to force the old identity back into place. The mind attempts to recreate motivation through discipline, comparison, or guilt. These efforts usually fail because the psyche cannot be coerced into reanimating a structure it has deemed false. Pushing harder only deepens exhaustion. The more honest response is to allow the withdrawal to complete its course. This process exposes how much of life was organized around avoidance. Activity masked emptiness, certainty masked doubt, and identity masked vulnerability. When energy is withdrawn, these defenses weaken, allowing unresolved emotions and unmet needs to surface. This surfacing is not a regression but an integration. The psyche is bringing fragmented aspects of the self back into awareness so they can be acknowledged rather than acted out through roles. Gradually, a new orientation begins to emerge. It does not arrive with intensity or urgency because it does not rely on fear. Energy returns in subtle ways, drawn toward experiences that feel congruent rather than impressive. Action becomes slower but more intentional. There is less concern with maintaining an image and more interest in responding honestly to life as it unfolds. The withdrawal of energy from false identities is a quiet revolution. It dismantles the illusion of self that was built for survival and creates space for a more authentic expression to take shape. What feels like loss is actually liberation. The psyche is no longer willing to finance a life that requires pretending. In the silence left behind, something truer is finally given the chance to breathe. productivity drops because anxiety is no longer available as fuel, even though it once powered an extraordinary amount of movement. Much of what is commonly praised as discipline or ambition is, beneath the surface, a refined response to fear. The fear of falling behind, of being judged, of becoming irrelevant, or of not mattering creates a constant inner tension. This tension pushes the individual to act, to produce, to stay busy. As long as anxiety is present and unquestioned, it provides energy, direction, and urgency. When awareness deepens, this mechanism is exposed. Anxiety is no longer mistaken for motivation. The psyche begins to recognize how much of its activity has been organized around avoidance rather than choice. Work becomes a way to outrun uncomfortable feelings. Achievement becomes a strategy to secure safety and approval. Once these patterns are seen clearly, anxiety loses its unconscious authority. It can no longer drive behavior in the same way because the individual is no longer fully identified with it. As anxiety loosens its grip, productivity often collapses. Tasks that once felt urgent now feel optional. Deadlines lose their emotional charge. The inner pressure that once compelled constant action fades. From the outside, this appears as a loss of drive or discipline. Internally, it is the nervous system exiting a state of chronic threat. The body no longer believes that survival depends on constant output. This shift can feel unsettling because anxiety-based productivity provided structure. It created a sense of purpose through urgency. Without it, time feels open, even empty. The mind searches for reasons to act but finds none that carry the same intensity. This absence is often misinterpreted as laziness or failure. In reality, the psyche is refusing to exploit fear as an energy source. Anxiety-driven productivity is costly. It requires continuous activation of the stress response, keeping the nervous system in a state of vigilance. Over time, this leads to burnout, emotional numbness, and disconnection from meaning. Awakening interrupts this cycle by bringing awareness to the toll it has taken. Once the cost is seen, the psyche withdraws cooperation. It will not continue to produce at the expense of inner stability. During this phase, there is often an attempt to replace anxiety with force. Routines, strict schedules, and self-punishment are used to simulate the old drive. These methods may produce short bursts of activity, but they quickly exhaust the system. Without fear as fuel, effort feels heavy and unsustainable. This reveals an important truth. Productivity that depends on self-coercion is not aligned productivity. The drop in output creates space for something previously drowned out by busyness. Sensitivity increases. Fatigue that was ignored becomes noticeable. Questions about meaning arise. The psyche is recalibrating, shifting from survival mode to orientation mode. It is learning to act from interest, care, and inner consent rather than compulsion. This recalibration requires patience because new forms of motivation emerge slowly. They are not loud or urgent. They do not demand constant motion. Instead, they respond to what feels alive, necessary, or meaningful in the moment. Action becomes more selective. There is less doing overall, but what is done carries greater coherence. Over time, productivity returns in a different form. It is no longer driven by anxiety about the future or fear of judgment. It arises from clarity and alignment. Work becomes an expression rather than a defense. Rest is no longer guilt-ridden because it is understood as part of sustainable functioning. The nervous system operates with greater balance, allowing energy to be directed where it truly belongs. Productivity drops because the psyche has outgrown fear as its engine. What replaces it is quieter but more durable. This transition may feel like a loss of power, but it is actually the end of an internal war. The psyche is no longer willing to sacrifice itself to stay productive. In that refusal, a more honest and humane way of working begins to take shape. Stillness and rest are not signs of avoidance or regression. They are essential phases of psychological integration. When long-standing patterns dissolve, the psyche requires space to reorganize itself. Integration cannot occur while the system is in constant motion, because movement often serves to bypass what has not yet been consciously metabolized. Rest creates the conditions in which fragmented inner material can surface, be felt, and find coherence within the larger structure of the self. For much of life, activity is used to regulate discomfort. Busyness becomes a way to manage anxiety, uncertainty, and unresolved emotion. Identity forms around doing, achieving, and progressing. When awakening disrupts these patterns, the impulse to stay in motion loses its compulsive force. The psyche instinctively moves towards stillness, not because it has lost interest in life, but because it recognizes the need for consolidation. What has been seen cannot be integrated at the same speed it was avoided. Stillness often feels uncomfortable at first. Without constant stimulation, the mind becomes aware of thoughts and emotions that were previously kept at bay. Old grief, fatigue, disappointment, or unacknowledged desires may rise into awareness. This can create the illusion that rest is making things worse. In reality, rest is revealing what was already present but hidden by activity. Integration requires this exposure. The psyche must be allowed to experience its own contents without immediately acting on them. Rest also plays a crucial role in recalibrating the nervous system. Prolonged periods of striving condition the body to remain in a state of heightened alertness. Even when external pressure decreases, the system may continue to operate as if threat is imminent. Stillness allows this chronic activation to unwind. As the nervous system settles, energy that was consumed by tension becomes available for repair and renewal. This process is slow and cannot be rushed without recreating the very stress it is meant to resolve. During integration, productivity often feels unnatural. The impulse to act before clarity returns has weakened, but new direction has not yet emerged. This liminal state can feel like stagnation, yet it is a necessary interval between old structures and new orientation. The psyche is suspending outward movement to listen inwardly. It is learning to distinguish between impulses rooted in habit and those arising from genuine alignment. There is often resistance to this phase because stillness challenges deeply ingrained beliefs about worth. Many identities are built on usefulness, efficiency, and visible contribution. Rest threatens these identities by removing their evidence. Without output, the question arises, who am I now? Integration requires confronting this question without immediately replacing it with another role. It asks for tolerance of not knowing, of being present without definition. Over time, stillness begins to feel different. What was once heavy becomes spacious. The mind grows quieter, not through suppression but through resolution. Conflicting inner demands soften as they are acknowledged and no longer compete for expression. Emotional energy becomes more fluid, less bound to defensive patterns. From this ground, new motivations arise naturally rather than being imposed. Rest during integration is not passive withdrawal from life. It is an active internal process, though it produces few visible results. The psyche is sorting, discarding, and reorganizing. It is determining what belongs and what does not. When this process is honored, action returns with greater coherence. Decisions feel less conflicted. Effort feels less forced. Movement becomes a response rather than a reaction. Stillness and rest are part of integration because wholeness cannot be assembled in haste. The psyche needs silence to hear itself clearly. What emerges from this quiet is not a return to the old pace, but the formation of a life that moves in rhythm with inner truth rather than against it. True motivation returns not as pressure but as meaning, and this difference changes the entire quality of action. Pressure-driven motivation is loud, urgent, and forceful. It relies on inner tension to create movement, using fear of consequences or imagined rewards to compel behavior. Meaning-based motivation, by contrast, is quiet and steady. It does not shout commands or threaten collapse if progress slows. It draws the psyche forward because something feels intrinsically worth engaging with, not because something must be escaped or proven. Pressure creates motion through resistance. There is always something being pushed against: time, expectations, other people, or one's own self-doubt. This kind of motivation demands constant reinforcement. Without deadlines, comparison, or anxiety, it quickly loses strength. Meaning does not require this reinforcement. It sustains itself through resonance. When an action aligns with inner values, the psyche invests energy willingly. Effort still exists, but it does not feel like self-violation. When awakening dismantles pressure-based motivation, there is often a period of apparent inactivity. This is not because meaning has disappeared, but because the psyche refuses to act without it. The old engines have been shut down, and the new ones are still forming. During this phase, attempts to recreate urgency feel hollow. The mind may try to manufacture importance, but the body does not respond. This signals a shift in authority. Meaning, not fear, is becoming the gatekeeper of action. Meaning-based motivation emerges from clarity about what matters, not from strategies to avoid discomfort. It is connected to lived experience rather than abstract ideals. Instead of asking, "What should I be doing?" the psyche begins to ask, "What feels true to express now?" This question cannot be answered quickly because truth is not conceptual, it must be sensed. Time, reflection, and engagement with one's inner world are required for meaning to reveal itself. As meaning returns, action becomes more selective. There is less interest in constant productivity and more sensitivity to relevance. Not everything deserves effort anymore. This selectivity can look like reduced ambition, but it is actually a refinement of energy. The psyche is no longer willing to invest itself in pursuits that lack depth or authenticity. What remains may be fewer in number but richer in significance. Pressure fragments attention. It scatters energy across multiple demands, keeping the psyche in a state of partial presence. Meaning concentrates attention. When something truly matters, focus arises naturally. Time feels different. Effort is sustained without force because the activity itself provides feedback and fulfillment. This is not pleasure in the superficial sense, but a sense of rightness, of being properly oriented toward life. Meaning also transforms the relationship with difficulty. Under pressure, obstacles feel like threats to self-worth or security. Under meaning, difficulty is experienced as part of the path rather than a signal to quit. Challenges are endured not out of fear but out of commitment. This gives resilience a different quality. It is not rigid persistence but flexible devotion. As meaning becomes the source of motivation, rest and action fall into a healthier rhythm. There is no longer guilt in pausing, because rest is understood as necessary for clarity. There is no frantic urgency to optimize every moment. Action arises when it is called for and subsides when it has run its course. This rhythm supports sustainability rather than exhaustion. True motivation returns as meaning because the psyche has learned that pressure is a poor substitute for purpose. What moves a person most deeply is not the demand to become someone else, but the invitation to express what is already alive within them. When action flows from this place, it may be quieter and less dramatic, but it carries a depth that pressure could never produce. And so this is not the end of your drive, but the end of being driven. What has fallen away was never meant to last, because it required fear to function and force to survive. What is emerging asks for something different from you. Not urgency, not self-pressure, not endless striving, but honesty. The quiet phase you are in is not empty, it is pregnant with meaning. When movement returns, it will no longer be about proving your worth or outrunning doubt. It will be about responding to what genuinely matters. You will act not because you are afraid to stop, but because something within you is ready to be expressed. And in that shift, motivation stops feeling like a burden and becomes a natural extension of who you have become.